What do Moses, Socrates, Charlemagne, Jesus, Abraham Lincoln, and Winston Churchill have in common? They were all around at the same time as China. While the Hittite, Roman, British, or Turkish empires rose and fell, China stood firm as a rock on the eastern side of Eurasia. Even today, we're seeing the rise of a militant, powerful China that stands to threaten the world order. This brings up the pertinent question of what is the essence of Chinese civilization? How do we understand this civilization that holds 1/5 of the human race? My job as a YouTuber requires a lot of time management and writing to make sure I'm presenting the highest quality work I can for my audience. That's why I use Grammarly. Grammarly is an all-in-one writing tool that greatly increases my productivity and ensures my scripts are easy to understand when I'm recording my videos. Grammarly fixes spelling errors, provides suggestions for clear sentence structure, and helps make sure my writing's the highest quality it can possibly be. Grammarly's been a huge help to me and is totally free to download, providing everything you need to make more concise emails, better essays, or whatever else you're working on. Grammarly is something for everyone from students to professional writers. Get through those emails quicker in your work by keeping it concise, confident, and the right tone with Grammarly. Grammarly also comes with other good features like free tone detector, premium clarity full sentence rewrites, and premium tone transform. Go to grammarly.com/whatifaltis to sign up for a free account and get 20% off Grammarly Premium today to help you work more efficiently. Central China, which then promulgated mass migrations out from there across all of East Asia, stretching from Japan to Indonesia, creating the genetic pool that's modern East Asians. From then on, we saw the Chinese form Stone Age villages that gradually got larger and larger until they formed small kingdoms. The Chinese claim that their civilization stretches back to 3000 BC under a certain dragon-descended yellow emperor who taught them civilization is unlikely, but you do see small kingdoms involved into the Shang state. The Shang were an ethnic Han theocracy based out of the North Chinese plain around 1600 BC, where the elite was built around communication with the gods. The Yellow River is one of the nastiest in the world, regularly changing its course by hundreds of miles, since the region's so damn flat, and so the Chinese had to build dams to keep the Yellow River from killing thousands of people when it floods, and to use its water for farming. In this regard, the ancient Chinese were pretty similar to other cultures around the same time, like the Babylonians and Egyptians, who formed civilizations to gather workers together to keep their rivers under control, and then formed governments that did the managing as theocracies that mediated between the gods who controlled the weather and the people. The king spoke to heaven, the god that the Chinese still worship today, by drawing pictures on turtle shells and then burning them, which is the ancestor of modern Chinese writing. However, the next stage of Chinese history hit when the Zhou Turkic nomads riding chariots took over China around 1000 BC and installed a feudal state where they gave the various tribal warbands different plots of land, which then split up China into a lot of different principalities and kingdoms. The Zhou Turks were numerically insignificant and quickly assimilated into Chinese culture, which brings up an interesting point that China is one of the few civilizations that didn't form from a combination of cultures, but instead from a continuous development of a single society over time. Western civilization is a combination of Christian, German, and Roman influence into a single culture, or India of Dravidian, Indo-Aryan, and Harappan influence, but China's really just an extension of Han society, with nomads coming and conquering every once in a while. If you look at genetic maps, you see Europe's a north-south gradient with local clusters forming around countries like England, Poland, or France, while India is also a north-south gradient, but each caste being its own ethnic group. Meanwhile, if you look at genetics, the Han Chinese are just a single massive genetic group, by far the largest in the world. This has allowed China to be the area that's been consistently unified by far the most in history, but also at the same time has predisposed the Chinese towards isolationism and ignoring the rest of the world. An important turning point that happened here is that the Zhou, in order to take power from the Shang monarchy, developed an ideological system called the Mandate of Heaven, in which heaven bestows power upon the emperor to govern the state. However, long story short, if the ruler is not moral, said power can be rescinded and the rebel can seize power. The idea of the Mandate of Heaven has persisted for the last 3,000 years of Chinese history, with even being invoked during the Tiananmen Square protests. This is interestingly the origin of John Locke's idea of the social contract that justified the American and French revolutions. However, this idea that power could become corrupt and then restored by the moral rebels has been a check on tyranny across Chinese history. The Chinese have had a pretty accurate and realistic view of history, and the new empire seizes power, governs well for a couple generations, becomes debauched and decadent, then you start to see peasant rebellions and famines, then a new rebel seizes power and restarts the dynasty after a period of disunity and warlords. This sort of thing has happened countless times across Chinese history. You're going to see this happening again and again through this video. After the Zhou monarchy had lost centralized control over China, we see a period from roughly 750 BC to 200 BC called the Spring and Autumn and Warring States period, where we see Chinese culture as it exists today form. Over this period, China saw the development of cities and trade, which around 500 BC, like it did across Eurasia, seeing the Axial Age, or a period when philosophers tried to figure out how to live a noble and good life. In China, this came in the form of three ideologies that would forever influence Chinese civilization afterwards. The first being Confucianism. Confucianism basically believes that we all have social duties to the people in our social networks that we must follow. These include loyalty of children to their parents, employee to employer, and ruled to ruler. Meanwhile, those higher up on the social network are expected to exchange said loyalty for benevolent guidance. Confucianism is in effect a social theory masquerading as a religion. Confucianism had a series of effects on China, the first being immense social cohesion. The Confucian countries have the lowest crime of anywhere in the world. The Chinese have died en masse on wars with unimaginable courage too many times to count. Confucian emphasis on the duties of ruler to ruled meant that China was one of the most enlightened despotisms in world history. Chinese regimes were often more humane rulers than anywhere else in Asia, and the Chinese abolished slavery before the birth of Christ. At the same time, the Confucian emphasis on education is why these societies are known for excelling so much at academic subjects today. However, the negative sides of Confucianism was fundamental conservatism. Confucius deserves to be winning some award for most conservative philosopher of all time. The point of Confucianism was to try to turn back the clock to the world that existed 500 years before Confucius, and return to the social code of the early Zhou dynasty. The Chinese have always looked to the past and have had trouble dealing with the future for this reason. As we'll see later in this video, Confucian radicalism has held the Chinese back in military, economic, and technological ability from not being able to keep up with the times. An important element to consider with Confucianism is that it promoted hierarchy in Chinese society. Whenever Westerners deal with Chinese organizations, they're often shocked to find that in meetings, only the leader speaks, while the lesser members of the organization stay quiet. Meanwhile, individual and fluid command structures are seen as better in the West. My high school best friend was Chinese, and he didn't like to ask my father questions directly, preferring to arbitrate through me since that would be a breach in hierarchy. The second religion developed in China was Taoism, which in a lot of ways is a counterpoint to Confucianism. Taoism is a bunch of folk beliefs wrapped together masquerading as a religion. It believes a couple things. The first is this general idea that there's this way that you should follow that generally involves going with the flow and not trying to force things. Secondly, that there's various magical rituals that a person can discover in order to attain immortality. Although this is brutal simplification, Confucianism was for the public life and Taoism for the private. During this whole era, China was going through a bloody series of wars that cut down the amount of Chinese states from over 20 to just one, the state of Qin around 220 BC. As almost always happens, the state that comes up on top in these horrifying conflicts is the one that's best organized and most savage. The Qin were like the Prussians of the ancient world, creating a massive government bureaucracy under a totalitarian emperor with a kick-ass military. The Qin formed an ideology called legalism, which in short believed that human nature was evil and that a strict legal code ruled by a harsh government was the only thing that kept society together. The individual existed to be a chess piece in the ruler's grand strategy game. This is an ideology that literally believed that the rulers should keep the population dumb, and that a king shouldn't love his wives too much lest they control him. The problem with legalism was that it was so cynical it couldn't provoke any loyalty. A great example was that the guy who led the rebellion that defeated the Qin state rebelled since he was late to an army meetup post, and since the penalty for lateness was death, he decided to rebel since he had nothing to lose anyway. The Qin state collapsed after a single generation since it was just too cruel and totalitarian to survive. Legalism became an evil word for the rest of Chinese history. However, the irony is that legalism became a structure for future Chinese governance and the political ideology for over 2,000 years, even though it was papered over with Confucian names and ethics. As a final bit to talk about China's religions, we need to cover a few generalizations about the Chinese character, that the Chinese are down to earth and reasonable. When I say down to earth, what I mean is the Chinese have always viewed the world practically without getting stuck in abstractions, philosophic debates, or broad theories. All these Chinese theories are in reality testable theories. Confucianism and legalism are political and sociological theories, and Taoism is, in theory, a series of rituals. The idea of an all-encompassing God comes from the Semitic peoples and of argued philosophy from the Indo-Aryans, and the Chinese lacked either to create a broad metaphysical view of the world. As a replacement for traditional religion, the Chinese are instead become quite superstitious. This is because they don't have a god to rely upon the anxieties of the world when life's really hard. They instead rely upon magic and other superstitions to make life seem more certain. And we see this in the various foreign religions that were able to conquer China. One example being Buddhism, where Buddhism basically sold itself in China by selling various magical tricks to peasants and Chinese people to kind of create psychic defense and good luck. And then communism sold itself in China by basically being a magical trick to catch up with the West. When I say the Chinese are reasonable, I mean that there have been very few wars of religion or campaigns of religious persecution in Chinese history. A single person could theoretically have belonged to all three of the ideologies above without a thought. Likewise, in China, we see the layering of thousands of years of belief on top of each other. The greatest religion in China is ancestor worship and worship of heaven, both of which have thrived since prehistoric times, while communism and Christianity have just been later additions to this rich heritage. Due to China's agricultural style, which requires mass cooperation, belief structures have always prioritized the collective over the individual. This has come in a variety of ways, one of which being the Chinese obsession with face, or how your personal status appears to others. While Westerners prioritize competition, China aims for harmony and cooperation. At the same time, Confucianism and Taoism put heavy emphases on rituals that Westerners would see as empty. For a traditional Chinese person, however, using the proper greeting to greet your social superiors is a matter of moral principle rather than just politeness. Something Westerners rarely see but is nevertheless vital is that the West is the only major society that's scaled up by using individualism and breaking down the family and clan. In the other main civilizations of Asia, the clan and family were the basic building blocks of society. In China, this is really profound, with families working as a unit to get people into government jobs. As an insurance policy, families would have multiple people trying to get government jobs at once, and if one was successful, he would support his entire clan. Likewise, China was polygamous until the 20th century. The seminal moment in which China unified as a nation was under the Qin, who not only conquered the other rival kingdoms around 220 BC, but also conquered the whole of southern China, which was inhabited by native tribes. As mentioned before, the Qin set up a framework of Chinese governance, but they couldn't maintain power for very long because they were so cruel and couldn't keep any loyalty. After the Qin dynasty, the Han rose to power, and they in effect set up the Chinese imperial model that would last until the 20th century. The Han are best thought of as equivalents to the Roman Empire, and they expanded the Chinese empire geographically to the borders that it would have at its largest extent until the present, with colonies in Central Asia and Vietnam. You see borders for three Chinas across history. The weakest is a Han-controlled China that's based around the south of the country, with the north controlled by barbarians. The second is the Han control the areas where ethnic Han are majority, or called China proper. And the third is when China is most successful, where China can maintain colonies out in Turkestan and Central Asia, as well as Vietnam normally. And the problem we run into is that it's very difficult to supply armies out in Turkestan and Central Asia because there aren't any rivers, and transportation in the pre-industrial world, not by water, was exceptionally expensive. So when you think of these Chinese armies fighting in places like Tajikistan, you have to view it similarly to American armies in the 20th century fighting on the moon. China is a very particular state in that it's by far the first country to form in history that's still around. What I mean by that is that the national identity that goes back the furthest of anywhere in the world is the Chinese, and the Chinese have what amounts to an unbroken descent from the China of Qin Shi Huangdi to the present. The state has been so powerful, in fact, that it's repressed the other elements in society. This is opposed to an area like India, where the society was so powerful as to effectively strangle the state across its history, or a place like England, where society and government were well balanced, meaning that a representative democracy developed. Confucianism allowed China to have powerful governments that weren't brutally oppressive and extractive, and allowed China to become quite wealthy for most of its history. The unity of China across 2,000 years and its continuing functioning as a society is a testament to China's ruling class, the mandarins or bureaucrats. The mandarins evolved during the Han Dynasty and took a couple hundred years after that to develop into the form they'd eventually settle into. The mandarins were government bureaucrats who would take a test like a mega SAT that determined their role in the government. Shockingly enough, the truthfulness of this test was largely maintained across history. The positive effect of the mandarins was to provide China with intelligent leadership. The negative was that, as bureaucrats are everywhere, they're quite conservative and unimaginative people. As we'll see, the government effectively crushed the other elements in the society from developing like the military, merchants, or priests. In starving the military, for fear it would become a competitor, the bureaucracy kept China weak and allowed its conquest by nomadic peoples many times. If China has lots of responsible mid-level governance, a problem it continually ran into was the bad emperor problem, and that there were no checks upon the emperor's power itself. And China was by far the most absolutist state in Eurasia in the pre-modern world. And that meant that a single bad emperor could just trash all the progress of generations before him. If there's a key fact to the Chinese Empire and its story, it's the northern frontier with the barbarians. Starting with the Qin dynasty, the Chinese faced continual attacks from the nomadic barbarians of the Mongol grasslands. The problem with fighting these peoples was that they were pretty difficult to control on their own turf. The Han Dynasty was able to do this after a lengthy multi-decade war that bordered upon genocide, but for later dynasties, the only way to pacify the grasslands was through alliances with other nomadic peoples. The nomads' mobility, however, made them horrifying opponents to fight, in that the Chinese armies normally lacked cavalry, being made up of archers and spearmen, and so the nomads could ride circles around the Chinese armies, while the Chinese didn't have a lot of recourse. The Chinese built and maintained the Great Wall as a way of lowering the mobility of these nomadic peoples on the dead flat North Chinese plain. It was normal for the nomads to conquer China outnumbered 100 to 1 multiple times over. The Han Dynasty was operating on a similar timescale to the Romans, and like Europe, the heartland of northern China was conquered by Mongol and Turkic barbarians, while the colonial southern state, which I guess is an analog to Byzantium, remained independent. The difference, however, between China and Europe was that the nomads were outnumbered 100 to 1 by the Chinese, and so assimilated quickly. Meanwhile, there were far more Germans in the Roman Empire, meaning they established themselves as a permanent ruling class. The barbarian descendants established themselves as a nobility in China. These nomadic peoples maintained their aggression, and so the Chinese formed their biggest empire ever in this period, the Tang. The Tang descendants of barbarians themselves were able to use barbarian allies to control Central Asia to the greatest degree of any Chinese dynasty ever. The barbarian conquerors, being foreigners, were open to foreign culture, and this was China's big era of cosmopolitanism. The capital of Xi'an had Christian, Muslim, Persian, and Sogdian populations, just to name a couple. This was also when Buddhism was introduced to China, which is basically the last innovation you saw in Chinese culture before the European colonization. Buddhism filled a similar role to Taoism, in providing a release from the conformity of Confucianism, with monasteries to escape the stifling Confucian family, and honoring social classes disliked under Confucianism like the merchants and women. As an overwhelmingly conservative society, Chinese culture largely set its mold around the birth of Christ. Something to make clear is that due to different circumstances and the long game of telephone it took to reach China, that the Buddhism as practiced in China, Mahayana Buddhism, is basically the opposite of Buddhism as was taught by Buddha. Buddha designed a nihilistic, atheistic, psychological journey, while Buddhism, as it developed in China, is an extremely optimistic group religion. And, for example, Buddha said not to turn his faith into faith's not even the right word, to turn his creed into a religion with demons, metaphysical views of the world like God, as well as magical rituals, and take the outward trappings of a religion with stuff like priests and structure. However, guess what Mahayana Chinese Buddhism did? Every single one of those things. Mahayana Buddhism mixed with Zoroastrianism in Persia, and then it was routed to China, and it mixed with Chinese customs to become something that bore no resemblance to what it was initially in India. This imperial cosmopolitan China came to an end rapidly with the An Lushan Rebellion. This was the bloodiest war in history up to that time, in which a Turkic chieftain led a rebellion against a centralized government that killed more people than World War I. The rebels were eventually defeated, but this resulted in a mass sea change in almost every aspect of China. With the defeat of An Lushan, China had trouble relying on barbarian noble elites that had previously dominated a lot of the military. This Buddhist barbarian elite did a good job of balancing out the Confucian civilian leadership to create a dynamic Chinese elite. The Tang dynasty kept going for another century plus after the An Lushan rebellion, but then a peasant uprising killed the traditional nobility, turning China into a purely bureaucrat Confucian-run nation. Around 900 AD, we saw China go through a sea change that would set its path for the next 1,000 years, the Neo-Confucian Renaissance. The Buddhists, who had been dominant since the fall of the Han Dynasty, promoted a cosmopolitan capitalist order, with the Buddhist monasteries strangely being massive investment brokers. However, the Confucian bureaucrats gained power and Confucian values gained greater currency. This video is going to be pretty critical about Confucianism, and this isn't actually an attack upon Confucianism as an ideology or anything Confucius said. More so that once a single social class seizes control of a society, it tailors that society towards its self-interest, and we've seen this bear fruit in each of the major civilizations with the exception of the West, and that was the West's great advantage. And in China, what happened was that the bureaucrats gained power, and for all their strengths, the bureaucrats drove China into a direction that eventually meant its decay as a civilization. At the same time, the bureaucrats used Confucian radicalism as the ideological justification for this trajectory. Another important shift occurred around 1000 AD. This was the settlement of southern China. In early China, the center of population was in the grain-growing north of the country. However, due to advances in rice agriculture, as well as adaptation among the Han Chinese to the south's malarial climate, meant that the population of southern China skyrocketed during the Middle Ages. For some context, this latitude-wise is like the center of America's population moving from Virginia to Florida. Rice-growing malarial climates make worse soldiers, given that irrigation populations suffer various diseases like ringworm that make them physically weaker. This is why the capital and center of power in China has always been in the north. The shift to the south took China from being a predominantly northern, grassland-facing, militaristic society to a water-based commerce one. One of the most important events in Chinese history was the construction of the Great Canal from southern to northern China over hundreds of miles, which fed northern China with southern rice, thus keeping the two regions wed together. Well, realistically, we could have very easily seen a world where South China had become independent. I've made a previous video where I talk about if China is a naturally authoritarian country, to which my answer is probably yes. However, I've also shown how China goes through cosmopolitan and isolationist phases, largely dependent upon how bloody their last major invasion by foreigners has been. In short, if the last foreign invasions killed a couple million people, it'll encourage China to try to compete with the rest of the world. And if it's killed tens of millions, it'll push China into PTSD shock that'll force it into isolationist period. I want to make clear that China was the wealthiest and most technologically advanced nation on Earth for most of this period, and these changes took centuries to work through. For example, in the centuries around 1000 AD, the Chinese invented gunpowder, paper, and the compass. China was also the beating heart of the global economy. However, for some examples, even though China invented gunpowder, it never started using it for guns and military progress, partially since China had fewer military competitors in the West, which was in a permanent state of Darwinistic struggle between nations, but also since the Confucian elite distrusted any technological progress. Likewise, the Chinese were on the edge of what many think was an industrial revolution in the 11th century, with massive blast furnaces and steel output larger than anywhere in the world until 19th century Britain, but the Confucian bureaucrats regulated it out of existence. To see the degree of cognitive dissonance, let's look at the Jurchen and Liao invasions of the 11th century, in which northern barbarian tribes conquered northern China from the Song dynasty. What the bureaucrat Chinese elite in southern China did at this point was write poetry at how much they wanted to conquer the north, while also not improving or funding their military, since using the army would be crass. The Chinese saying at the time went something like, in the same way that good iron doesn't go into nails, good men don't go into the army. Chinese invasions of areas like Mongolia, Vietnam, or Burma, often outnumbering their opponents on a 10-to-1 basis, normally failed for reasons Western militaries would have found laughable. For example, Chinese infantry had no drill or coordination in fighting, charging as a mob while their armies often didn't have enough supplies of food or water. This resulted in humiliation by the nomadic peoples time and time again. After the Jurchen and Liao conquered northern China in the 11th century, the Mongols conquered all of China in the 13th. This is one of the bloodiest wars in history with over 40 million deaths, a greater number than the European theater in World War II. The Chinese eventually did kick the Mongols out in the 14th century under the Ming dynasty. The Ming instituted an even harsher version of Confucianism as a backlash to the humiliation under the Mongols. We see a seismic shift occur in which the entries for tests to get into the government went from very open-ended essays that looked for general knowledge and creativity to extremely boring and strict, which effectively selected for less imaginative leadership. This was exactly when China should have been looking for imagination, however, with the arrival of the technologically advanced Europeans at their doorstep. The Ming were a deeply authoritarian state, with the state gaining very powerful positions over society and the economy. Confucian norms became even stricter, with big implications for women. Women in the Buddhist era often had a great deal of influence, but under the Ming they were married off at around age 15 and sequestered in home their whole lives. A barbaric practice called foot binding emerged, in which women would have their feet broken to make them smaller, making it difficult for them to walk, which supposedly made them more attractive. The bureaucrat elite had no interest in expanding China's borders or colonialism. Take the famous voyages of Zheng He, where in the early 15th century the Chinese had the most developed boats in the world and in fact sailed out as far as Eastern Africa, receiving tribute from Indian Ocean nations. The East Indies and even the Pacific coast of America were militarily weak, and China was experiencing massive population growth, so colonialism would have been logical. However, only a single emperor pushed for voyages outwards, the Yongle Emperor, and after his death, the isolationist bureaucrats, who had no interest in colonies, burned all the ships and turned China inwards. It would be easy to describe Chinese civilization at this point as fundamentally decadent. Long story short, I consider decadence as disconnect from reality, and real results being the norm and trumped by popularity contests. This was a state where, rather than enacting real policies, the emperor would often just change names and ceremonies to deal with external problems in proper Confucian fashion. In 1644, the Han Chinese again faced humiliation at the hands of nomadic conquerors, at this point the Manchus. They again conquered China, outnumbered 100 to 1, but then assimilated into Chinese culture. All of the cultural trajectories under the Ming dynasty continued under the foreign Manchu Qing dynasty. China's myopia to the west is kind of shocking in retrospect. They first made contact with the Portuguese in the early 16th century, who built a trading fort at Macau. Also, Spanish gold from the Americas was incredibly decisive to how the Chinese economy worked in the early modern period, with the recession caused by the 30 Years' War in Spain helping cause the collapse of the Ming dynasty. A telling example of this is that when the British sent an expedition to China in 1790 asking for trade, the British brought rifles, steam engines, clocks, and other technologies that were literally hundreds of years ahead of anything China had. The Chinese returned to the British that they had no interest in foreign trade, as the British really had nothing of value to offer them. In some ways, this made sense. At the time of the Napoleonic Wars in the early 19th century, China still had the largest economy in the world by a vast margin, and China had subdued the neighboring kingdoms like the Tibetans, Zungurs, Mongols, and the like to become the largest extent it ever had across its history, while nearly all the neighboring states were Chinese vassals. However, the Chinese were deeply out of touch with the modern world. The British in the 1840s started the deeply immoral Opium Wars, in which the British in effect forced the Chinese to buy their hard drugs and opium from India so the British could afford more goodies from China on a trade balance. With a handful of steamships and basically no casualties, the British were able to bring the entire Chinese coast to its knees. In a later war, the British even sacked the Imperial Palace. This opened up a can of worms called the Century of Humiliations, in which the pattern of the fall of dynasties in a civil war was combined with China's rape by technologically more advanced areas like Europe and Japan. China had horrifying famines that killed tens of millions, alongside having to surrender trade rights, many ports to foreign countries, surrendering the northern territories to Russia, a rebellion by Christians that was the third bloodiest war in all of history, and finally having a third of their country conquered by Japan during the Second World War. China was forced to very painfully abandon thousands of years of cultural assumptions at the turn between the 19th and 20th centuries. This came in too many forms to easily count, either with the banning of polygamy and foot binding, the introduction of Western science, capitalism, and the like, a total revamp of Chinese civilization. There were two factions of Chinese in this toss-up battle for the new China. Christians largely under American influence and communists under Russian. The communists won out in our world, but I don't think that was really necessary. I also think it was an overwhelmingly negative move. Besides Mao being the greatest mass murderer in history of all time, killing somewhere in the range of 40 million people, the communists also kept China poorer than other cynic nations like Korea or Taiwan. Also, as a person who's been to China, the communists with the Cultural Revolution killed much that made China great. The Cultural Revolution was an all-out war against China's traditional culture in which teachers were killed, temples burned down, forests torn down, and the like. The process of remaking China went too far. The biggest thing that got me down about China today is just its soullessness. The only thing people really believe in China anymore is materialism. The cities are ugly, the air is polluted, people are incredibly unhappy, and the government's deeply nationalistic, cruel, genocidal, and authoritarian. If you compare it to a poorer country like Thailand, the Thais are happier and live in a more human and pleasant society. The best thing you can say about the Chinese communists, however, is that they were more clever than a lot of other communist parties. Communism didn't kill the soul of China in the same way it did in Russia, and that the market was only gone for a generation. The communists did an extremely clever growth of China's economy, with China experiencing the fastest and largest economic growth in any era of history ever over the last few decades. At the same time, the Chinese government has done a pretty good job of expanding their influence around the world and advancing technologically. This shouldn't be taken for granted. I'm not going to go too deep into China as it exists today, given that I've already covered it in greater depth in other videos. However, I will safely say that China is the greatest threat to the world order today. China has lots of problems dragging it down, and I expect them to have a dynastic collapse, in which tens of millions at least die, and the centralized government falls apart over the next few decades. However, the Chinese are a proud people, and I don't expect them to go out quietly. Dealing with China at this critical moment will be decisive to the future of the human race. China is still in a process of transition from what it was as an empire into what it's becoming in an industrialized, globalized world. China's so big that it will remain Chinese at its core, but what that means is dependent upon history. China has lots of tendencies inside it towards aggression, harmony, conservatism, or rapid change. The only thing you can trust the Chinese to do is execute whatever plan they have with competence for a time. It's our role in the years to come to help guide China as an international community, whether through peaceful or violent means, towards a path that is in concord with themselves and the rest of the world. As a final note, I would like to make clear that the Chinese have been guided by strong senses of honor and decency across their history. This is a nation that could produce immense good if structured correctly, one of the most profound civilizations ever, if not of all time. What a Feltist, and thanks for watching. If you enjoyed that video, please like, comment, subscribe, and please stay tuned for additional content. Or alternatively, check out my Pearl Pillar Patreon. As always, thanks so much for watching and have a great day.